We pick up in 2001 to 2003, and this is where my story stops being the story of a foster child moving through placements and begins becoming the story of a child psychologically disappearing inside of a system that documented every symptom of trauma while failing to recognize the trauma itself. Because by this point, I was no longer simply a child in care. I was becoming a case, a behavioral profile, a monitored problem. A child increasingly reduced to reports, meetings, counseling notes, behavioral observations, and adult conversations happening behind closed doors without me ever truly being present inside of them. And that transformation is one of the most dangerous things the foster care system can do to a child. Because once a system decides who you are on paper, every adult after that begins interacting with the paperwork before they ever interact with the human being standing in front of them. By this point, the reunification with my biological family had already collapsed again. The instability within the home continued, the dysfunction continued, the concerns continued, and according to the very records I later retrieved through Freedom of Information, Child and Family Services, schools, counselors, courts, and social workers continued documenting emotional concerns, supervision concerns, school issues, behavioral deterioration, conflict, and ongoing ministry involvement surrounding my siblings and I. And what makes these documents so powerful is not what I remember, it is what they themselves recorded. Because the records prove that the system was already documenting a child under immense psychological strain. Yet despite all of those professionals, all of those meetings, all of those interventions, the child himself was slowly disappearing underneath the labels being attached to him. And by this point, the government was preparing for long-term wardship proceedings. And I need people to truly understand the emotional reality of what that means for a child. The state was no longer simply intervening in my life temporarily. The state was becoming my childhood permanently. Strangers now controlled where I lived, who raised me, what school I attended, what reports were written about me, what therapists I saw, what labels followed me, what version of me became believable. And once a child realizes they have almost no control over their own life while being constantly watched and assessed by adults holding enormous institutional authority, survival itself becomes psychological. You begin monitoring every word, every reaction, every facial expression, every emotion, because you understand instinctively that adults are building a version of you behind closed doors that you yourself cannot control. I ended up in what I now refer to throughout all legal proceedings as Campsack Foster Home Number 2. This became my third foster placement, my longest placement, and the foster home where the majority of my records begin intensifying dramatically. And from the very beginning, something about that home felt wrong. Not loud, not chaotic, controlled. There is a certain kind of danger children learn to recognize that has nothing to do with screaming or violence. It is quieter than that. Colder. It is the feeling of walking into an environment where every part of your existence immediately feels monitored. That house felt like performance from the moment I entered it. Performance for social workers, performance for schools, performance for counselors, performance for documentation, and underneath that performance was fear. The foster mother was completing nursing courses and foster parenting classes during this period, meaning that whenever she was away from the home, my sister and I were left in the care of her daughters, two of whom were older than me and one around my age. And this is where the difference between documentation and lived experience becomes critically important. Because the files do not fully describe what was happening inside of that home, the files document what was being reported, not necessarily what was real. Around this period, behavioral reports involving me begin increasing significantly within the records. Conflict, aggression, emotional concerns, difficulty getting along, counseling involvement, behavioral deterioration. But what those reports consistently fail to ask is the single most important question. Why? Why was this child reacting this way? Why was this child emotionally escalating? Why was this child constantly dysregulated? Why was this child increasingly struggling psychologically? But the reality was this. Whenever the foster mother left for classes, her daughters would force my sister and I to complete not only our own chores, but theirs as well. And if we resisted or questioned it, they immediately contacted their mother and reported that I was aggressive, disrespectful, refusing to listen, or causing problems. And every single time, the foster mother sided with her daughters before I ever had the chance to speak. Now understand the psychological damage that causes to a child. Eventually, children stop trying to explain themselves when they realize that adults have already decided who is believable before the conversation even begins. And by this point, I had already carried the most dangerous thing a foster child can carry inside institutional systems: a behavioral label. The records already describe me as loud, emotional, difficult, hyperactive, oppositional, reactive, and hard to manage. And what nobody appeared willing to meaningfully understand was that I was not a bad child. I was a traumatized child with an undiagnosed neurodivergent nervous system trapped inside chronic instability. Years later, I would be diagnosed with ADHD and autism, which means that while all of this was happening, my nervous system was already struggling with emotional regulation, sensory processing, impulsivity, attachment disruption, hypervigilance, and chronic overwhelm while simultaneously enduring abuse, instability, emotional fear, repeated apprehensions, and institutional control. That combination is psychologically catastrophic for a developing child. But instead of understanding the injury, the system documented the systems. And eventually, the documentation itself became part of the injury, because every emotional reaction became evidence supporting the narrative already attached to me. Every disagreement became proof that I was difficult. Every attempt to defend myself became viewed as manipulation or escalation. Every trauma response became another behavioral concern, and another label began attaching itself to me during this period: thief. The records contain concerns involving food and stealing. But what those reports fail to emotionally capture is that I had already come from a home involving chronic food insecurity and hunger. Children raised around food scarcity do not experience hunger normally. Their nervous systems become weird around survival. Fear that food will disappear. Fear that nourishment is temporary. Fear that if you do not eat now, there may not be another opportunity later. So when I got out of bed one night and took cookies from the kitchen, I was not acting from malice. I was hungry. But trauma was never interpreted as trauma inside of that home. It was interpreted as misconduct. And that moment changed my childhood permanently. Because after the cookie incident, the corner punishments began. Or as the foster mother herself referred to them, sentences. And I want you guys to think carefully about the psychological language being used toward a child here. Sentence. As though I was not a traumatized foster child, as though I was a criminal. The next morning, I was forced to stand facing a corner for hours until school, while the other children mocked me repeatedly for being a thief. And I remember trying desperately to explain myself, trying to explain that I was hungry, trying to tell them that that it was only cookies, trying to explain that I was not trying to hurt anyone, but none of that mattered. Because once systems reduce children to labels, those labels become stronger than the child's actual humanity. And eventually something horrifying happens psychologically. The child stops believing they made mistakes. They start believing that they are the mistake. That is where the prolonged confinement and isolation truly began escalating. At first, it was standing in corners for extended periods throughout 2001 and 2002, going into 2003. But eventually the punishments evolved into something much more psychologically severe. Bedroom confinement, isolation from the rest of the family, and extended periods alone. Separation from normal childhood interaction. And before I move into the next chapter of this story, I need people to understand something deeply unsettling. All of this was happening while social workers, counselors, therapists, schools, and professionals were heavily involved in my life. Adults were everywhere. Documentation was everywhere. Meetings were everywhere. Reports were everywhere, and yet, despite all of that professional involvement surrounding my life, nobody meaningfully interrupted what was happening to me psychologically. Nobody stopped the narrative. Nobody stopped the isolation. Nobody stopped the escalating confinement. And nobody stopped the behavioral construction that was happening around me. Instead, the focus increasingly became managing the child rather than understanding the child. And that is the exact moment systems become dangerous. Because one approach protects children, the other conditions them into silence. By 2003, I no longer felt like a child being helped. I felt like a child being psychologically buried alive underneath paperwork. My name is James Mineau, formerly known as David Arndt. I am a former foster child and foster care survivor, public keynote speaker, and advocate bringing these conversations into schools, organizations, media platforms, podcasts, and social services across Canada. Through more than 1,085 pages of government documented records, I am exposing the difference between institutional documentation and lived reality inside the foster care system. Because eventually survivors grow up. Eventually, survivors retrieve their files. Eventually, survivors realize they were never the monster the paperwork made them out to be. And eventually, survivors stop being afraid of the systems that spent decades convincing vulnerable children that their voices meant absolutely nothing. This is not content. This is not entertainment. This is evidence. This is testimony. This is accountability. This is a childhood on record.